I was asked to talk about particularly the ending of the latest phase of the peace process and the unity government, the Palestine, Hamas unity government, and the two are related. The peace process, so-called, was terminated by Israel because the unity government was established. There's been some discussion of this, but the only really accurate account of it that I've seen, which I'll just quote, is by a very distinguished Lebanese political analyst, Rami Khouri. He points out, I'll quote him, that the national unity agreement between Fatah and Hamas precisely mentioned that Hamas had agreed to these three demands: recognition of Israel, nonviolence, and adherence to previous agreements. The conditions that the quartet, that's the U.S., EU, Russia, and the United Nations, mainly the U.S., that the quartet set on 30th of January 2006, important date which I'll come back to. Israel told President Abbas that he had to choose between peace with Israel and a pact with Hamas. The American government predictably described Palestinian unity as unhelpful. So when the Israelis and the Americans suddenly came face to face with a united Palestinian leadership that openly and explicitly accepted the Israeli-American terms for diplomatic engagement, the Israelis and Americans ignored their own terms for talks and totally shattered the most recent attempt to negotiate peace. This kind of reckless hypocrisy or straightforward lying is bad enough in itself, but it's made even worse by the fact that on the Israeli side, there are ministers in the Netanyahu government who reject the quartet's three conditions. They reject Palestine's right to exist, they reject previous agreements, most notably the Oslo Accords, and they reserve the right to use violence against Palestinians and other Arabs and create their envisioned Greater Israel from the Mediterranean to the Jordan River. That's accurate as far as it goes, but it doesn't go quite far enough. There are two other preconditions that the Palestinians are required to accept for the so-called peace process. One precondition is that it be run by the United States. That instantly tells you it's not going to get anywhere. The U.S. is a participant, not a neutral party. It's as if someone were to suggest that the Sunni-Shia conflicts in Iraq be negotiated by Iran. We'd all laugh. And this is exactly the same, even worse, because the U.S. is directly a partner, just as Khouri says, it's a partner of Israel. If there were to be a serious peace process, it would be negotiated by some party that has a degree of credibility in the international arena, maybe Brazil or somebody like that, certainly not the United States, which not only is a partner here, but is regarded by the world as the greatest threat to world peace. You don't know that if you're a reader of the American press, because the American press doesn't report things like that. But there was a major international poll last December, run by Gallup in the United States, its British counterpart. And one of the questions was, which country is the greatest threat to world peace? The United States was so far out in front that no one else was even close. A second, way behind, was Pakistan, and that was inflated by the Indian vote. Nobody else is considered a major threat to world peace. But that's not the kind of thing it's nice for Americans to know, so the press uniformly suppressed it with a single exception. A Murdoch tabloid, New York Post, ultra-right tabloid, did mention it and cited it as an example of how crazy the world is. How can anybody think that about us, you know, the greatest proponents of peace? Well, that's it. So the one condition is the negotiations have to be run by the country that is the greatest threat to world peace and that is a partner of Israel in the interaction. So, of course, it's not likely to get anywhere. The other precondition is that settlement expansion must be allowed to continue. The Palestinians must accept that as a precondition for entering into negotiations. Now, of course, the United States says, well, we don't like it, but they do it with a wink that says, fine, go ahead, we'll pay for it, we'll give you the diplomatic support for it, and although that we say we don't like it, we in fact think it's fine. And that was in fact demonstrated with great clarity in the most recent U.S. Security Council veto. There are many of them. The most recent was February 2011 on Obama, which did receive a little attention. Usually these are never mentioned, but this was mentioned because it was kind of extreme. Obama vetoed a Security Council resolution calling for the implementation of official U.S. policy. So that did receive a couple of words. The resolution called for an end to settlement expansion. U.S. vetoed it. Israelis have no problem determining what that means, just as they have no problem understanding what it means when the U.S. continues to provide the military, economic, diplomatic, even ideological support for the settlement expansion. Notice, incidentally, that settlement expansion is a very minor issue, though that's the only one anyone talks about. The issue is the settlements. I don't know what happened to the map that was up there, but they can, well, you can imagine it. Oh, there it is. The settlements are basically green. White, sorry. It's the huge area around Jerusalem, which goes, essentially bisects the West Bank. It goes to practically to Jericho, including the town of Ma'ale Adumim, which was built mostly during the Clinton years in order to ensure that there would be no meaningful political settlement. It essentially bisects the West Bank. Now, the white part is partly settled by Israel along the Jordan Valley, where they're kicking out Palestinians rapidly, and partly is kind of uninhabitable, so it gives you a misleading impression. The green part, I'm sorry. The white part is being settled by Israel. There's another corridor up to the north. First part goes to the town of Ariel, built in order to break up what's left of the West Bank, and above it, the one to the north goes to a town of Kadumim, also intended to cantonize whatever may be left of the Palestinians. All of this is illegal. It's not controversial. The highest international authorities have been very explicit on this. Security Council of the United Nations, in a unanimous vote, there was one abstention, United States, but an otherwise unanimous vote declared all of these settlements illegal. The International Court of Justice made the same ruling. In the area around, the white area around Jerusalem, which Israel calls Jerusalem, is a vastly expanded region which Israel has in fact annexed in violation of explicit Security Council orders, which even the United States voted for. There's more, but we'll keep that. That's the problem, the settlement. Settlement expansion, which is what's talked about as an additional reason why, an additional barrier to any potential peace process. Well, that's, but those are the two preconditions that Palestinians have to accept. First, accept negotiations run by the United States, Israel's partner, the greatest threat to world peace. Secondly, accept expansion of settlements, not just settlements, all illegal. And thirdly, the three conditions that I mentioned: recognition of Israel, nonviolence, and adherence to previous agreements, which the Israeli government doesn't accept, and the United States, of course, doesn't accept, but the Palestinians must. And when they did accept them, negotiations were stopped because Israel announced that it won't deal with a unity government. Well, what's the problem about a unity government? I quoted Khoury that these conditions were established on the 30th of January, 2006. What happened then? Well, shortly before that, what took place was a very important event, the one and only free election in the Arab world. Carefully monitored, judged to be free and fair. It only had one problem. The wrong people won the election. So therefore, the U.S., in line with its famous love for democracy, immediately imposed a harsh punishment on the Palestinians for voting the wrong way. Harsh sanctions. Israel, of course, imposed harsher sanctions and also escalated its direct attack. It's constantly attacking Gaza, particularly, but off there on the left, and the West Bank all the time, and it sharply escalated them. That was the U.S.-Israeli response to the one free election. Now, this was, Khoury also mentions the Oslo agreements. The Oslo agreements, one element of them was that the West Bank and Gaza are a territorial unity which cannot be divided. As soon as the Oslo agreements were signed in 1994, the United States and Israel instantly moved to separate the West Bank from Gaza. They'd actually started it before, but extended it right away in violation of the agreements for a good reason. If Gaza and the West Bank are separated in violation of international agreements that the U.S. solemnly signed, well, you don't need the map to see it, but if you think about it, if Gaza and the West Bank are separated, the West Bank is completely imprisoned. Whatever autonomy might be granted to Palestinians in some of those cantons in the West Bank will have no access to the outside world. It's surrounded by Israel. In fact, as Israel settles the Jordan Valley, which was over to the right, completely imprisoned by Israel, Israeli U.S. ally Jordan right next to it, no further access to the outside world. Gaza is the one access to the outside world. So it's therefore quite crucial for the U.S. and Israel to make sure that the Oslo agreements are not, you can see it there, are not enacted so that there'll never be, whatever crumbs might be given to Palestinians will be even more meaningless than they might be otherwise. That's very critical. More should be said about this. The U.S.-Israeli rejection of the agreements that they had demanded as soon as the Palestinians accepted them, that's traditional, goes far back. If history were not self-suppressed here, we don't know about this. So let's mention a couple of cases. In 1971, the government of Egypt, President Sadat, offered Israel a full peace treaty, normalization of relations, everything, in return for Israel's withdrawal from the Israeli-occupied Sinai, Egyptian Sinai. That would have been, Israel had to make a decision at that point. They made the most fateful decision in their history, I think. A peace treaty with Israel would ensure essentially complete security. It's the only military force in the Arab world that means anything. And right next door, of course. So the choice was, should they accept security or insist on expansion? At that time, it was a labor government, the so-called moderates, the Doves. They had plans, which they were just about to implement, already implementing, for extensive settlement in the Egyptian Sinai. They were planning to build a big city, 1 million people on the Mediterranean, the city of Yamit, many settlements, kibbutzim, other settlements in the Sinai. They were driving out thousands of Bedouin who lived there. And Bedouin aren't just people who wander around. They had towns, villages, mosques, cemeteries, all destroyed, people driven into the desert. And that was the choice. Shall we expand into the Sinai, Egyptian Sinai, or accept security? They considered it, And the cabinet, Golda Meir cabinet, rejected the agreement. There was another proposal from Jordan the following year, full peace treaty and return for evacuation of the Jordanian territory, West Bank. That wasn't, I don't think that one even got a response. The question, as always, is what's the U.S. going to do? Well, there was actually a bureaucratic battle inside the United States government. The State Department was in favor of accepting the Egyptian offer, which was very much in line with official U.S. policy. Henry Kissinger, who was National Security Advisor, was opposed. He wanted what he described, what he called stalemate. He insisted on stalemate. Stalemate means no negotiations, just force, no diplomacy, just force. And it was assumed at the time, pretty broadly, that Israel had a virtual monopoly of force. So it was safe to say, well, let's forget negotiations, just support Israel's policy of forceful expansion. That's what happened. Sadat made every effort to try to convince the United States to accept political settlement. He was essentially disregarded, mocked. To everyone's surprise, he did launch a war in October 1973 to recover, actually to try to get the diplomatic process going. And the war surprised everyone. Turned out to be a very close call for Israel. In fact, for the world. Kissinger at one point declared a nuclear alert. The reason for that, we've learned from recently declassified documents, is that the United States and Russia had jointly imposed a ceasefire, but Kissinger had privately informed Israel that they could violate it if they wanted. And in order to make sure that the Russians didn't react, Kissinger called a nuclear alert. Well, fortunately, as always, the Russians backed down, so we're here to talk about it. But it was a serious issue. And after that, Kissinger recognized you can't treat Egypt as a basket case. You start what's called shuttle diplomacy, ended up with the Camp David agreements, 1978-79, in which Israel and the United States essentially accepted Sadat's 1971 offer. That's, however, in a much harsher form for the U.S.-Israeli point of view, because by 1979, Palestinian nationalism had entered the international agenda, and the U.S. and Israel were forced to make some kind of a commitment to Palestinian national rights, unlike 71. In the United States, that's regarded as a diplomatic triumph, President Carter's great achievement. If you take a look at it, it was a diplomatic catastrophe. The U.S. and Israel finally accepted a version of a 71 offer, which was harsher from their point of view, and did it after a major war with thousands of people killed, a threat of a lot of suffering, threat of nuclear war, but they finally accepted it. Well, what did Israel do? As I mentioned, Palestinian nationalism entered the international agenda in the mid-70s. In January 76, an event took place which is wiped out of history here, like such events generally. What happened is that the three major Arab states, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, brought a resolution to the Security Council calling for a two-state settlement on the internationally recognized border. That's the border that goes around the edge there. Two-state settlement, and then they used the standard diplomatic language with a guarantee for the right of each state in the region, Israel and Palestine, to exist in peace and security within secure and recognized borders. By now, that's a virtually universal international consensus. It's accepted by the Arab states, Palestinians, Organization of Islamic States, includes Iran, Europe, Latin America, essentially everyone, with the usual two exceptions. The United States and Israel don't accept it. But that was January 1976. What happened is that the United States vetoed the resolution. When the U.S. vetoes a Security Council resolution, it's essentially a double veto. First of all, it's not implemented, but secondly, it's vetoed from history. So you might try a research project and see if you can find it discussed anywhere. Actually, you can if you look at, I've written about it, a couple of other people have. You can find it in the New York Times, January 22nd or so, 1976. But it's essentially out of history. The U.S. vetoed a similar resolution in 1980. That's under Carter. That's out of history. Long record in the General Assembly, annual votes, more or less 160 to 2 or something like that, U.S. and Israel. They're never reported. One of the vetoes was reported, the one I mentioned, February 2011, when the United States, Obama, vetoed his own policy, which did get mentioned. That's the diplomatic record. And Israel had an interesting reaction to the January 76 offer. Remember that it offered to, the offer was that each state, including Israel, would have the right to exist in peace and security within secure and recognized boundaries. So therefore, it was necessary to raise the barriers to block negotiations. At that point, this concept of right to exist entered. Israel insisted, and the U.S. backed them, that the Palestinians must not only accept their right to exist within secure and recognized borders, but their abstract right to exist. No state has a right to exist. States are power systems established by violence. They're recognized, but their right to exist is not recognized. So, for example, Mexico does not, it recognizes the United States. It does not accept the right of the United States to exist sitting on half of Mexico, conquered in a war of aggression, violent war. And the same with other states in the world. But Israel uniquely has to have a right to exist, which means the Palestinians have to accept the not only the fact of their dispossession, but its legitimacy. That's a way to raise the barriers to ensure that the threat of peaceful political settlement won't be pursued. That happened again just a couple of years ago when the current government of Israel added a new demand. The Palestinians must accept Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. No state in the world is recognized as an ethnic state, as the state of some part of its population. So, for example, Pakistan is recognized, but it's not recognized as an Islamic state, though it calls itself the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. Countries can call themselves what they like, but nobody else in the international system recognizes them as racist states, which is what it means to be an Islamic state or Christian state or Jewish state or white state or whatever. So this is a unique demand, again, imposed so as to to raise a further barrier to negotiations. And what's happening currently is that when the Palestinians accepted all the conditions, the U.S. and Israel ended the negotiations. No further way to raise a barrier, apparently, though maybe somebody will think of one. Well, that's an encapsulated history, a lot more, of course. What's more is worth mentioning. So I'll mention a couple of things. In 1988, the Palestinian National Council, that's the highest governing body, formally recognized the two-state consensus of the international community, formally agreed to it. Israel reacted to that. They reacted at once by announcing, quote it, that there cannot be an additional Palestinian state between Jordan and Israel. In other words, Jordan is a Palestinian state. The Jordanians don't think so. Palestinians don't think so, but what do they know? We say that Jordan is a Palestinian state, and there cannot be an additional one. Furthermore, the fate of the occupied territories, the West Bank and Gaza, will be settled according to the guidelines of the government of Israel. That was the Israeli response to the Palestinian formal acceptance, tacitly accepted before, of the international consensus. As always, the question is, what's the U.S. going to do? Shortly after that, a couple months later, came what's called the Baker Plan, James Baker. You read the Baker Plan carefully. It doesn't explicitly endorse the Israeli position. That would be a little too blatant. But what it says is negotiations can take place and Palestinians will be permitted to participate in negotiations if they accept the Israeli position. Okay? So it actually goes beyond the Israeli rejectionism. It says we, of course, accept it, and Palestinians can negotiate if they accept it too. Okay? That's 1988. And so it continues. The Oslo agreements were established in 1994, but it was instantly obvious that they were, what had actually happened was that after the first Gulf War in 1991, the U.S. was in a position of just overwhelming power, and President Bush did organize negotiations called the Madrid negotiations with selected Palestinians permitted to participate. They didn't get anywhere. The reason they didn't get anywhere is that the Palestinian negotiating team was led by Haider Abdel-Shafia, probably the most respected person in the Palestinian territories, a serious, dedicated nationalist, and he balked at one condition. He insisted he wouldn't sign anything that permitted settlement expansion. Remember, the problem is the settlements, not the expansion. But al-Shafi's condition, he refused to sign if it was going to allow further expansion, which of course Israel is planning, and the U.S. So they broke down. At that point, an end run took place around the Palestinians by Yasser Arafat. He was in Tunis. The outside Palestinians trying to get back into the act. They made a deal with Israel through Norway. Those are the Oslo Accords. The Oslo Accords made no condition about settlement expansion. In fact, the Oslo Accords offered nothing to the Palestinians. You should read them. It's easy. You can look it up on the internet. There was a declaration of principles, 2 or 3 pages, you can find it. If you look at it, what it says is that the final result of negotiations, the final settlement, will adhere to United Nations Resolution 242. Anyone familiar with the diplomatic history knows what that means. You can look up UN 242. It offers nothing to the Palestinians. The only mention of Palestinians is vague rights of refugees. So the final outcome of the Oslo Accords is to be a settlement in which nothing is offered to the Palestinians, literally. And it proceeded exactly that way in the following years. As I said, the U.S. and Israel immediately separated Gaza from the West Bank in violation of the agreements. The government of Israel, this is the dovish government, the Yitzhak Rabin, Shimon Peres, rapidly expanded settlements. Clinton, of course, supported it. Settlement expansion continued in a straight line right through the 1990s. Goes on from there. I could go on through the rest, but that's essentially the story. Can there be a political, let's go back to what's just happened. When the negotiations broke down, John Kerry made a statement which quickly went viral. He said that unless Israel accepts a two-state settlement, they might become an apartheid state. That blew up. You saw the reaction, hysterical reaction in the United States and in Israel. He had used the A word. You're not allowed to use that word. Of course, he wasn't saying that Israel was an apartheid state. He said that unless it accepted a two-state settlement, it would become an apartheid state. Actually, that's universally accepted by Israelis as well. What he was assuming is that there are two options, and this is standard, not just Kerry, virtually everyone, Israelis, Palestinians, solidarity groups, constantly present the situation as if there are two options. Either the international consensus on a two-state settlement, or else Israel takes over the whole region, and then there'll be a civil rights struggle, an anti-apartheid struggle. There'll be one state from Jordan to the sea with pretty soon a majority of Palestinians, and you really have an anti-apartheid struggle. And in fact, Israeli commentators who call for some kind of two-state settlement do so because if that happened, Israel could no longer be what's called a Jewish and democratic state, whatever that's supposed to mean. But whatever it's supposed to mean, it wouldn't be possible with a majority of Palestinians. So the doves say, look, we can't accept this. That's Kerry's comment. Two things to discuss about it. One is the A word. I'll come back to that. And the other is the question of what are the options. And that's quite crucial. On all sides, the analysis is simply incorrect. Those are not the two options. The two options are either a two-state settlement or Israel continues to do exactly what it's doing with continued U.S. support. And we know exactly what it's doing. That map more or less indicates it. Vastly expanding Jerusalem way into the West Bank has nothing to do with traditional Jerusalem, annexed in violation of Security Council orders, corridor off to the east to the town of Ma'ale Adumim, essentially bisecting the West Bank, and two corridors up north, breaking up what's left, settling the Jordan Valley, which imprisons the cantons that are left. The region that is being developed and taken over by Israel will have very few Palestinians. First of all, it doesn't have many Palestinians to begin with because the Israeli expansion programs are careful to avoid the heavy Palestinian population concentrations like Nablus and Tulkarm. They don't want them. They want the Palestinians. So there won't be, and the Palestinians who are there are being systematically expelled. You can follow it day by day. Israeli army comes in to a village, announces this is a military zone. You have 24 hours to get out. People can pick up whatever pieces of furniture they can manage and get out and find a way to live somewhere. And then the areas, the village is demolished and the military zone soon turns into another Israeli settlement. That's the standard technique, constant. Actually, it's been going on for 100 years in one form or another, but now it's an official state policy. That's the alternative. The end result of that, as this region is gradually integrated into Israel, will be a greater Israel that actually has a lower proportion of non-Jews than Israel does today. Lower proportion, because many hundreds of thousands of Israelis will be integrated and very few Palestinians. That's the alternative to a two-state settlement. There is just no possibility, realistic possibility of Israel taking over the whole region of a one-state settlement. That's a chimera. You can forget about it. And maybe it could happen in the long run after a long process, which one could discuss. But it's not an option for the foreseeable future. That's one point. The second point, what about the A word? That's used pretty commonly, and it's quite misleading. Within Israel itself, there is severe discrimination, but it's not apartheid. In fact, it's not all that different from what exists here and in many other countries. A little harsher, but not fundamentally different. But it's not apartheid. Bad, but not apartheid. In the occupied territories, the situation is much worse than apartheid, much worse. You have to recall that in South Africa, the white nationalist community depended upon the black population. That was 85% of the population. It was their workforce. They couldn't live without them. They had to, it was kind of like the slave population in the South. You needed them. You can't get rid of them and maintain the same economy and system of wealth and power and so on. And in fact, the apartheid government it lent some support to the black population, just similar to the way slave owners kept their slaves alive. If you have a capital investment, you try to maintain it. So you own a car, you try to keep it going. That the black population was their workforce. So there were some developments for the black population. They tried to sustain them. And remember that they were trying to get international recognition for the Bantustans. So they wanted to try to make them more or less respectable. They didn't get any recognition, but they tried. The situation in the occupied territories is totally different. Israel does not want the Palestinians. Israel's attitude toward the Palestinians is like the U.S. attitude toward the indigenous population here. They should be exterminated. That's what settler colonial societies are like. Societies like the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Israel. These are special kinds of imperial societies where you don't try to integrate the domestic population, you try to get rid of them. It was explicit in the U.S. case, like George Washington, who was called by the Iroquois the town destroyer, which is because that's what he was doing. His view was that the Iroquois nation has to be extirpated. Thomas Jefferson said that unfortunately we're going to have to exterminate the native population because they attack us. They refuse to just fade away. And that's the whole history of the settlement of the national territory. That's why you don't find Native Americans around. Canada didn't get quite that far. They left them off in the fringes. Australia, Aboriginal groups are around somewhere, but very marginalized and suppressed. And that's essentially the character of settler colonial societies. Israel is one. So they don't want the Palestinians. They want them out or marginalized or cantonized. But so the situation, the circumstances that are being constructed are far worse than apartheid. So the A word isn't really appropriate in either case. There is one respect. It's common to draw comparisons between Israel and South Africa. You read that all the time. And if you read the history of South Africa, which is worth doing, you find that there really are some parallels, but not the ones that are discussed. Apartheid is not a good analogy. The analogy that's accurate is the way apartheid developed and collapsed. And the story is roughly like this. We know from declassified documents. In 1958, the nationalist government, which had just instituted the apartheid regime formally, the foreign minister of South Africa called in the American ambassador. We have the colloquy. He told him essentially, look, we know that we're becoming a pariah state. Everyone's turning against us. They don't understand the legitimacy and virtue of what we're doing. We're constantly voted down in the United Nations. We're going to be isolated. But it really doesn't matter because you and I know that there's only one vote in the United Nations. That's yours. And as long as you support us, as long as the U.S. supports them, they can go ahead doing whatever they like. That's basically what was recognized in 1958. And that's pretty much what happened. Throughout the following years, opposition to apartheid developed substantially. It became an enormous international movement that reached the United States by the 1980s with corporations pulling out, Congress passing sanctions against South Africa, which Reagan vetoed, and Congress passed over his veto, and he then violated them, increasing support for South Africa. Reagan was the last supporter of the apartheid regime in the international system, the last major one. He was Reagan refused to believe that there was a race issue in South Africa. His view is that there are just a lot of tribes, the Zulu and the whites and others, and they're having some tribal difficulties, but they got to sort it out that way. The rest of the world had already turned strongly against apartheid. Thatcher kind of supported Reagan, but not as strongly. But Reagan held on to the end. In fact, as you may know, Nelson Mandela's African National Congress was condemned by the Reagan administration in 1988, right near the end of the apartheid regime. It was condemned as one of the more notorious terrorist groups in the world. And Mandela was, in fact, on the U.S. terrorist list until just a couple of years ago. When he came to the United States, he had to have special dispensation. Finally, a special legislative act was passed to remove him from the terrorist list. That was the U.S. attitude towards South Africa. And it remained. The apartheid system was maintaining itself. In around 1990, U.S. policy shifted. And for a couple of good reasons, it moved towards accepting a kind of a compromise that the white nationalists and the ANC were reaching. And at that point, the apartheid system collapsed. Well, there are other examples like that. Another example is Indonesia's invasion of East Timor. Indonesia, in 1975, invaded East Timor, Portuguese colony, former Portuguese colony, carried out a really genocidal attack. Probably a quarter of the population was murdered, all with U.S. support, strong U.S. support. Went on for 25 years. Other Western countries also supported it. In 1999, September 1999, under quite severe international pressure and domestic pressure as well in the United States, President Clinton informed the Indonesian army that the game was over. One phrase, actually, he said, it's the end. They pulled out the next day. U.S. power is very strong. Should say, however, that there were other factors in the South African case, crucial ones. One was that there was a compromise that could be reached. Nothing analogous in Israel-Palestine. The compromise, and the one that was reached, was that the socioeconomic system would remain unchanged, but there would be black faces in the limousines. So some blacks would be allowed to enter the elite. It's the end of formal apartheid, but basically the system of power would remain unchanged, with some blacks in positions, super wealthy and so on. And that's pretty much what happened. That satisfied South African business, international business. The ANC accepted it, state authority, international states accepted it. And there's no analogy in the case of Israel-Palestine. The other difference is a critical one, and one that you're not allowed to know about in the United States, so I speak about it in a hushed voice, pretend you didn't hear it. The other reason was a country called Cuba. Cuba played an enormous role in the liberation of South Africa, all of Africa, in fact. South Africa had invaded the surrounding countries. Angola was holding Namibia in violation of UN orders, trying to create a kind of a region that would be dominated by white South Africa. Cuba sent, first of all, tens of thousands of technical workers, doctors, and development aides, and so on, to maintain the countries, but also sent troops. It sent military troops to Angola, which drove out the South African invaders. The U.S. was furious. That's part of the reason for the U.S. hostility to Cuba, many reasons, but that's one. They drove out the South African invaders. They forced South Africa to abandon Namibia. And crucially, these were black soldiers. And that was very significant. It broke the kind of myth of the superhuman white, I don't know what they called them, the invincible white white men, showed the black soldiers could defeat them and drive them out of Angola. That had a big psychological effect all over Africa, both on the black and the white community. The white community recognized they're not going to be able to establish their region of power, and they did finally move to accept apartheid. Well, there's no parallel to that in the Israel-Palestine case. It's left actually in the hands of people like you. The only thing that can create a breakthrough in Israel-Palestine is for the United States to change its policy. I don't think there's any other realistic option, at least in the short run. And that's by no means impossible. These policies are not graven in stone. They do change. I gave a couple of examples. There are others. And in fact, as this meeting itself illustrates, sentiment is changing in the United States significantly. Not many years ago, if I tried to give a talk like this at MIT, I'd have to have police protection, literally. And the police would insist on accompanying me back to my car because it was too dangerous. And meetings were broken up, tons of hostile questions, screaming and so on. That's changed enormously. By now, Palestinian solidarity is maybe one of the leading issues on campus. Large groups of young people are involved, engaged. There are efforts at boycotts, sanctions, and so on. All a radical change. And this can extend into compelling a change in policy. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to happen by itself. There's plenty of forces that insist upon maintaining the tight relationship with Israel, which is very valuable to American elites and industry and military industry, others in many respects. But it's not graven in stone. It can change. And I just can't think of any other way in which there could be a break in this system. Well, let me stop there. Are there mics around?
Thank you. John Hasboon from Bethlehem, West Bank. So it could be optimistic, but what is the national interest from the United States? Some argue that it's a strategic geopolitical. What is the national interest that needs to change in order for the national policy to change for the U.S.?
Well, before commenting, let me ask a prior question. What does the phrase national interest mean? I mean, the phrase national interest is used standardly in the academic world. International relations theory claims that states pursue the national interest. That's the leading principle of all discussion. What is it? I mean, does the CEO of General Electric have the same interest as the janitor who cleans his floors? No, they have totally different interests. Now, there's all kinds of interests. And what's called the national interest turns out to be the interest of dominant domestic forces in U.S. society. So the national interest means the interests of the very rich, major corporations, the ones who set government policy and so on. That's the national interest, and not the population. The population is basically irrelevant. The population often strongly opposes government policy, and they're simply disregarded. And not just on this case, many others. I say take Cuba. For 50 years, the United States has been waging a war against Cuba. Major terrorist war, not trivial. It's not these jokes about Castro's beard that the press talks about. Major terrorist attacks, thousands of people killed and so on. An embargo, a crushing embargo that the whole world opposes. How does the U.S. population feel about it? Well, there have been polls since the 1970s, large majority of the population thinks we should normalize relations with Cuba. Does anybody pay attention to them? No, doesn't make any difference. In fact, the gap between public opinion and policy is enormous on issue after issue. I mean, take, say, domestic issues. For, again, about 40 years, there are regular polls asking people what they think about the tax system. Overwhelmingly, people say there should be much higher taxes on the wealthy. What happens? Taxes on the wealthy go down. And it's the same on issue after issue. We do not live in a society in which the public determines policy. The public's around, but basically disregarded unless they force themselves into the system by serious activism. And I think that's true of national interest. So let's take national interest in its real sense, the interest of those who are in a position of power in American society to be able to make decisions. What's their interest? Well, lots of interests. Some are straight strategic. You go back to 1948, the Joint Chiefs of Staff were very impressed with Israel's military performance during the 48 war and recognized, as they put it, that Israel could become a valuable base for American power. They said it's the major military force in the region outside of Turkey, and it would be a perfect ally and base for U.S. power. The oil dictatorships, Saudi Arabia primarily, they made it very clear that they didn't mind. There was not going to be any threat to U.S. oil interests. In fact, they had their own Saudi Arabia is a family, basically, the royal family. They made it quite clear that, that even though they had to publicly condemn Israel, they didn't really mean it. They actually thought it was fine if Israel was there. Their concern, remember, at the time was Britain. The main concern in the Arab world was Britain and Jordan, which was Transjordan at the time, which was a British colony, and a Hashemite rule. And the Saudi Arabia had just driven the Hashemites out of the holy territories, Mecca and Medina. They thought they might be coming back. They didn't want that. They wanted a deterrent to Jordan, Transjordan, especially because the British were trying to set up a Hashemite system which would govern both Transjordan and Iraq, which is regarded as a serious threat by Saudi Arabia and what are now the Emirates. And Israel was a kind of a deterrent, so they didn't really mind. And in fact, that continues. Saudi Arabia and Israel have fairly common policies right now. Furthermore, in 1967, crucial year, that's when the U.S.-Israel relationship was actually established in its current form. Before that, it was kind of friendly, but nothing unique. Became unique after 67. Something happened in 67. Israel provided a great gift to Saudi Arabia and the United States. There was a conflict, there has been a long-standing conflict between radical Islam and secular nationalism. And the United States, like Britain before it, has pretty consistently supported radical Islam, still continues to. The center of radical Islam is Saudi Arabia, the most extremist radical Islamist state in the world, and also a missionary state. They try to expand their Wahhabist, Salafi doctrines all over the place. And they're the strongest ally of the United States. Britain had similar policies. In 1967, there was a war going on between Saudi Arabia and Egypt. Egypt was the center of secular nationalism. Israel invaded Egypt and pretty much destroyed its base in the Arab world, also Syria. Serious blow against secular nationalism, great victory for radical Islam, big victory for the United States, which regarded Nasser's Egypt as the main threat. That's when the special relationship was established. And it continued like that for this time I go on. It remains a major strategic base. In fact, if you want to know how serious it is, one of the most interesting of the WikiLeaks was a list of regions of the world that the Pentagon regards as super important, have to be protected, no matter what. One of them is right outside Haifa, Rafael Military Industries. It's a high-tech military industry right outside Haifa, one of the places where most of the drone technology was developed. It's so closely linked to U.S. industry and to the Pentagon that they actually shifted their management headquarters to Washington, where the money is. But it's just essentially part of U.S. military industry. And that's just the beginning. It's a major, for U.S. military industry, Israel's just a bonanza. When the U.S. gives high-class jets to Israel, of course, Lockheed Martin makes a lot of money, but it's more than that. When the United States gives Israel high-tech military equipment, that's a teaser, as they call it in the retail business. Saudi Arabia comes along and says, hey, we want some of that stuff too, and we want a lot more. So Lockheed Martin is happy to sell $60 billion worth of, Lockheed Martin and others, of second-rate equipment to Saudi Arabia so that they can be happy that they have a lot of this stuff too that they don't know how to use. So it's a terrific bonanza for military industry. Also, Israel provides special services. It can try out advanced military equipment against live targets. That's what they're doing all the time. You can't usually do that, but Israel's doing it constantly. When they attack Gaza, Operation the West Bank, when they invade Lebanon, they've done 5 times. They are testing advanced U.S. equipment, figuring out what works, and they develop their own equipment, of course. They're a major supplier of advanced military equipment, including equipment for suppression. They train U.S. police forces, for example, and plenty of work in the Third World. In fact, when Reagan was blocked from direct support for South Africa, Israel was used as a conduit, and same in Central America. So there's plenty of services like that. But there's a lot more. One reason is, one factor that tends to be underestimated, I think, is Christian Zionism. Christian Zionism goes back way before Jewish Zionism, way into the 19th century. And it's a very significant elite phenomenon in the United States. Say people like Woodrow Wilson, Harry Truman, and so on, that read the Bible every day, and are believers in the biblical prophecies. Well, the Bible says, God promised the land to Israel, so got to give it to Israel. In the Roosevelt administration, one of the leading figures, Harold Ickes, described the return of the Jews to Palestine as the greatest event in history. By now, it's expanded from elite Christian Zionism to mass popular Christian Zionism, with the enormous rise of the far-right evangelical Christian movement since mainly pretty much in the 1950s. It was always around, but became expanded and organized. It's a major base for the Republican Party. And they're super Zionist. They're also extremely anti-Semitic. Their theology, if you read it, is you have to support Israel because that'll lead to Armageddon. And everybody gets slaughtered, and the souls that are saved rise to heaven, and everybody else goes somewhere bad, and including all the Jews. You can't be more anti-Semitic than that. But 160,000 Jews can be saved because they're going to recognize Christ in time, or so. That's the story. There are tens of millions of Americans who believe this. They're a large part of the base of the Republican Party now. It's one of the reasons why the Republican Party is more extreme in support of Israel than the Democrats are, even though the money and the votes mostly go to Democrats for Jews and liberals. Another factor, which I think is underestimated, is what I mentioned before. The U.S. is a settler colonial society. It's based on extermination of the native population for the greater good of all. That's the way we, that's of course part of the background. So when you see Israel doing the same thing, you should support it. It's just instinctive, you know. If we did it, it's got to be right by definition, and they seem to be doing it, so you know, it's got to be right. I think that's a not negligible factor. In addition, there's a significant lobby. There's an ethnic lobby, which is powerful, but ethnic lobbies are pretty limited in their power. I mean, they can be overwhelmed by the major lobbies instantly. I mean, the military lobby, for example, dwarfs AIPAC. The Chamber of Commerce, you know, the business lobbies dwarf all of them. If they really decided that their interests were being harmed, they would put the lobby out of business in no time. So they're there, but as long as their actions support the national interest in the real sense, you know, the interest of the powerful, you know, they're influential. So you can get votes in Congress, you know, 100 senators voting for recognize the capital of Jerusalem, which then they don't do, things like that. When the lobby runs into conflict with real U.S. power, it just backs off. They're not idiots, and that happens in case after case. But these are plenty of factors, and I think they can be overcome, but we shouldn't underestimate their significance. Well, you want to?
I have a question along somewhat similar lines. So I'm curious, I guess you would probably say that Israel is in a lot of way acting against its own self-interest, according to whatever national interest definition you choose to use. But I'm curious, but obviously the Israelis do not believe that, or at least many Israelis don't believe that. So I'm curious why you think Israel has the policies that it has.
In the short term, Israel's doing quite well. It's a rich Western society. It's close links to Europe, very close links to the United States. It's expanding into the the West Bank exactly as it wants to. They're not being bothered much. You know, there's no other force in the region that can threaten them. They talk about, Qassam rockets from Gaza, but that's pretty much a joke. I mean, first of all, they don't amount to much, and if Israel wanted to stop them, it knows exactly how to do it. In fact, we should all know. In June 2008, there was a truce between Israel and Hamas, which runs Gaza. The truce was that Hamas would not fire any rockets, and Israel would drop the siege. Well, Israel didn't live up to the truce, but Hamas did. There were no rockets, period. You can read the Israeli official website if you like. In November, Israel invaded Gaza, the day of the U.S. elections, and killed half a dozen Hamas militants. And then rockets started being exchanged. And there were casualties, all Palestinian as always. In late December, Hamas offered to renew the truce. Israel considered it and rejected it, and instead launched Operation Cast Lead, a murderous attack on Gaza, a horrifying attack, supported by the U.S., of course. And if they wanted to stop the rockets, they could reinstate the truce. But as far as they're concerned, they're doing fine. In fact, the standard line in Israel is to describe themselves as a villa in the jungle. Israel's a villa. Everybody's enjoying themselves. You can go out on the beach, go to the restaurants, nightclubs. It's one of the gay centers of the world. The religious Jews are a pain in the neck. Some Palestinians are a bother, but basically it's a pretty nice place for people who want to, educated, relatively wealthy people who want to live a happy life. So why should they change? Of course, they're facing serious problems, but that almost never bothers any state. I mean, take the United States. Anybody who's literate knows that we're marching towards a precipice in which we might destroy the prospects for decent existence. in the near term. If you're even literate, you know that. How do we react? By marching faster. When you hear, euphoric commentary, like the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, had an 8-page supplement on the great prospects for the American economy. That we're going to have 100 years of energy independence. It will become the Saudi Arabia of the 21st century. Fossil fuels become so cheap, we'll undercut Europe and bring manufacturing back to the United States. So let's all cheer. What's going to happen as a result of that? You all know. We're going to destroy the possibilities for decent existence for your grandchildren. Does it matter? No. What matters is short-term profit, your next bonus. That's what's the national interest. In fact, the corporate sector is working overtime with propaganda campaigns to try to convince people either that there is no global warming or that the humans have nothing to do with it. In fact, you read the business press like the Wall Street Journal or Forbes, they not only poo-poo it, they say we're moving into a period of global cooling. So let's use as much fossil fuels as we can. They read the same scientific reports that you do. But who cares? We can enjoy ourselves and enrich ourselves in the short term, so the heck with our grandchildren. It's not unusual.
Hello? Oh, yes. So I want to ask a question regarding, so you have discussed the prospect for Palestine mainly in terms of two major players, which is Israeli and Americans, but how about other powers, for example, the Russian or the Chinese? Do they have any interest in Palestine?
Do they have any interest in relations with Russia and China?
Yes.
Yeah. In fact, China, I don't know how far it's gone because it doesn't get reported much, but China has been planning, may actually be proceeding, to build a rail line from Haifa to Eilat. If you look what that means, I don't think it shows it, but it would be down to the Red Sea. Israel's now got deposits of natural gas off in the Mediterranean, and China would like to have access to them. The easiest way, avoiding the Suez Canal, which could be blocked, is directly to the Red Sea and then off through the Indian Ocean and China. Pakistan, they're building ports in Pakistan and so on. So they have pretty good relations. This project has been announced. How far along it is, I'm not sure. But China has no serious objection to what Israel's doing. They have economic interests of economic power and so on. They don't lose anything. They have no particular love for the Palestinians. Same with Russia. You know, Israel and Russia have fairly decent relations. You may have noticed that Israel was one of the few countries in the West that was very silent about the annexation of Crimea, partly because they don't want to prejudice their relations with Russia. Again, the Russians have part of the tragedy of the Palestinians is that they have essentially no international support for a good reason. They don't have wealth, they don't have power, so they don't have rights. That's the way the world works, you know. Your rights correspond to your power and your wealth. Same inside the United States. Shouldn't be surprised to see it. If you're a poor black kid in Roxbury, you don't have the rights of a rich person living in the suburbs, right? Same in the international arena. So the Palestinians, I mean, they may get, you know, statements of support, but nobody's going to do much for them, especially when the U.S. Threatens anyone who might try to do something.
We have gone over time, so this would be the last question.
You spoke earlier about the relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel. I would like to know your perspective towards the recent events of cyber terrorism between Saudi Arabia and Israel.
Which recent events do you have in mind?
The hacking of the bank accounts and the stuff that happened between Saudi Arabia and Israel like 2 years ago.
What happened? What events? I'm not sure what you're referring to. Saudi Arabia and Israel have pretty amicable relations.
So, like, what about back in the day in King Faisal, when there was the cut of oil?
Cut of oil.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you take a look at the oil system, take a look at the prices of commodities around 1950, okay, and then compare what they were in 1970. Actually, the prices of commodities rose pretty sharply, but not the price of oil. That stayed low and stable. That was part of Saudi Arabia's gift to the U.S. as its role within the U.S.-dominated system was to keep oil prices low, and it did. By 1970, oil prices were very cheap as compared with what they would have been if they had kept up with the rise of commodities generally. And the oil price rise essentially brought them to where they would have been. In fact, the United States had done the same thing just a couple of years earlier. At the time, the U.S. was the major exporter of coal. And a couple of years before that, the U.S. sharply raised the price of coal. Okay? Nobody made a fuss about that because we were doing it. It was harmful to the other countries that rely on coal, but it's not our business. So Saudi Arabia and its allies did raise the price of oil to roughly what it would have been if it had kept up with commodity prices. And the U.S. didn't really mind that very much. In fact, if you take a look at the negotiation, it was good for the United States in certain ways. It harmed Europe. It didn't harm the U.S. much and didn't harm Britain much. In fact, the rise in prices made it possible for the U.S. and Britain to begin to exploit expensive oil resources that were too expensive to use before that, Alaska and the North Sea. That's when the U.S. was able to U.S. oil companies were able to begin to exploit the Alaska oil resources. Before that, they would have been too expensive. The same with Britain and the North Sea. These were big shots in the arm to the energy corporations, which did not really, in fact, their profits went way up. So they were doing fine. And the U.S. didn't really mind. In fact, Kissinger tried to keep the European countries from getting together to do anything to combat the price rise. So it wasn't exactly welcomed in the West, but it wasn't anything that they considered very harmful. And more serious was what happened in 1979 when Iran went off the system. But they compensated for that.
Thank you very much, Professor Chomsky. If we can all give a round of applause for Professor Chomsky. So thank you all for joining us today. It was a pleasure to have you here. If you want to join our mailing list, there is a piece of paper at the table at the back, so just write your email. And we'll have events next year, so make sure to come to them. Thank you.